This is part 2 of the content on Freud's psychoanalytic theory, and here we'll talk about the psyche. So you already know from our introductory lecture that Sigmund Freud is considered to be the father of Western psychology. You learned a little about his background and family in that lecture, and you also learned that he has some definitely controversial ideas. And his ideas, especially related to women, have gotten him some disregard or disrespect. And so it's important when we consider these historical theorists that we just remember that just like we are today, they are products of their times, and we don't want to throw out their ideas. Rather, we want to scrape away the factors that were time-related. Like his attitudes towards women and his hyper-focus on sex. We want to scrape that away and get to the really quite beneficial core of what the teachings are underneath. And so he is known to have broken new ground exploring unconscious influences, the power of the mind to influence the body through his conversion disorder, and the power of psychoanalytic processes, exposing the triggers, talking through, identifying the triggers that impact us, the power of that in diluting these unconscious factors. So we also talked a little bit, so I won't read you this whole slide, but we talked about how libido, the drive for life, is what he posited to be the deep motivation underneath all of us, that no matter how strongly we learn to navigate it, it's still a driving force that we cannot get away from, and that sometimes crops up in us even if we don't expect it. So one of his early findings when he was practicing with patients is his discovery of what he called conversion disorder. It's when somebody, he was a neurologist, as you'll recall, it's when somebody has physical symptoms, like they can't move a limb or something like that, and there's no physical cause that he could discover in the body. And of course, now we're much better at understanding physical causes, and we understand more subtle factors in the body, and we have exposure to Eastern medicine and more holistic perspectives. But nevertheless, there is accuracy in the fact that things that happen in our mind can shape things that happen in our bodies. And so he was right in linking these two psychological roots. And so in considering that, we're going to go in and look at how he understood the psyche to be constructed. And we'll use this metaphor of the Titanic. And you probably know the story that the Titanic ran into an iceberg. But you'll recall that the iceberg on top of the water was not all that substantial. Most of the iceberg, what actually destroyed the Titanic, was underneath the surface. And that is how this happened with the Titanic. Here it is, looking like it's clearing the iceberg, and instead it hit what was underneath the iceberg, and what was underneath, what was hidden below, had the capacity to sink the entire boat. And Freud would liken this to our own unconscious factors, to the influences inside of us that can destroy us or cause us to explode, and we can't even see what the trigger was. So he likens our psyche to an iceberg, similar to what we just saw in the previous. And we can see that our psyche is represented like this. The tip of the iceberg is our conscious awareness. This is what we're aware of in the immediate world, the factors that influence us, the situations that caused us, the information we can take in through our senses, or the like the social interactions that we're engaging in, or the things we're seeing and doing, all these things that we're aware of in the present moment. And it's all on top of the water. We can see it. It's clear. If we get angry because somebody just pushed us, that's a very clear cause-effect relationship. Somebody pushed us, we're angry. That makes sense. It's all conscious. And then we also have preconscious states of consciousness, like our dream states are considered to be that. They're preconscious because they're not quite in our awareness. We can pull them up sometimes and recall them. Or recent experiences, things that we can remember and pull up, and so we can recall things and understand why they influence us. So if we had a lot of bad interactions with a person, we have a coworker who's really aggressive all the time and kind of rude and unkind, and when that person interacts with us, we feel tense, we can still see the causal relationship. We can remember the past experiences that are causing us to feel a certain way. And those things are considered preconscious. It's not maybe right there in our mind, but we can pull up actual incidents that we can remember. But the biggest part of the iceberg you'll see is down below. It's called the unconscious, and it's things like our instinct, those gut reactions of fear or something like that, our intuitive information, or a traumatic event where we may not even remember much of it. Fears that we can't explain the source of, or passions, attractions that we don't quite know why we have them, and maybe there's even a little shame around them. And he would say that all of those types of things are in our unconscious. And so we're not presently aware of them. And we can't recall these incidents, but they still slip out. And in today's lingo, we would call them triggers, like those things like when we get disproportionately angry over something that shouldn't really cause us to get that angry. We sometimes say we're triggered. And that's because there are unconscious memories that are cropping up that are exaggerating the emotions that might not even be an appropriate response to a situation. So an example that I sometimes give relates to balloons, because even to this day, after all these decades of life, I have like a fear of things popping. I don't even like to pop balloons. I mean, I kind of shudder and shy away from them. And I don't know why. Like, there's nothing that I can recall in my past. I don't like to put air in my tires. I even paid someone like $10 to put air in my tires one time because I so much dislike doing it, because I have this idea that the tire is going to explode. And I don't have any memory of an explosion. It's a disproportionate fear. It's not quite the same as a trigger, but it is an irrational fear. I don't think there are even any known incidents of people accidentally blowing up their car tires when they put air in them. So it's an irrational fear, but yet it's still always present. And another one that I have that I'll probably also mention in class is like, I have this fear, almost I shudder if I see like a scissors or a knife sitting out on a counter. And this happened to me just a few days ago going into the bathroom. I keep a scissors in the bathroom, and it happened to be sitting on the front of the shelf inside a cabinet. But when I opened the cabinet, there was the scissors. And it was that same thing, like, oh, and I pushed the scissors to the back. And I don't quite know why. I think maybe I watched some really scary movie where a stranger entered the house and picked up a knife off the counter and went on to, slaughter the victim or some horrible thing like that. But I don't remember it. But it's to this day this long-standing little shudder that happens inside me when I see a knife. And of course, we have more examples of this, that happen for real in our lives. A disproportionate reaction to something our partner says is the type of thing that Freud would say stems from these unconscious factors beneath the surface. And that's where most of what we are is. And so he says this is what relates to this psychic determinism that we talked about in our last class. So psychic determinism, all of our behaviors, he says, are determined, caused by unconscious factors, which means we don't have any choice. We think we have free will. We think we're not going to get angry when that happens next time. Next time we'll do better. But he says, no, we just have no choice unless we work through these things, because they're coming from our unconscious. They're like the gears that are set in motion outside of anything we can control. Unconscious forces beneath the surface about which we are unaware that cause all of our behavior. So determinism is a pretty strong term. It means that we don't have any choice. So keep that in mind. Okay, and libido we already talked about. And so within that, then he gives our personality a structure, and he divides it into three areas. Id, what we're all born with, the pleasure principle. We'll talk more in a moment. It's primitive. It's our drive for life. It's what causes a baby to cry and eat food right after it's born. And then we have the ego, mature, mediating, kind of realistic, as the child begins to learn that it can't get its way just by screaming and wailing. It figures out other ways to have its needs met, to have its libido drives met. And the superego are like the morals, the guilt, the societal pressures on us that cause us to suppress our id drives. So let's look more at each of these, although let me first point out some of these images. The id is like sort of like the devil. It drives us to selfish desires, to getting our own needs met. The superego is always like this angel, the obeying all of the rules and pleasing our parents and things like that. And these two forces are always in tension within us, and the ego is what kind of balances those out so that we can actually live a happy and successful life. So just a little bit more. Id, this is like the gratification of our desires. It's our instincts, our motivation to live. It's what caused that man on the Titanic to push the women and children out of the way and get into that boat. That was an id drive. He would say that all this energy is in fact sexual energy, the drive for procreation and reproduction, and we transform that into other things. So this woman eating all this cake, well, he would say this is sexual energy that's being transformed into this desire for food. And so it's pleasure. It's the pleasure principle. It wants whatever feels good at the time. He would say that it's biologically driven. So it's the desire to reproduce that has this reality. We have to reproduce for the human race to survive. The pressure that it exerts on an individual, well, it varies by how great the need is, how great the drive is. And so if we're really, really hungry, that's a really strong drive. And so then what's going to satisfy this drive? Well, we can't always get what he would say the ultimate drive is for sex, and we can't get that all the time. So then what's going to satisfy it? We have some odd words in here. Something got cut off in here. What's going to satisfy it depends on what's available right then in that moment. And so we just seek to get whatever direction we can that's going to give us pleasure in that moment, kind of makes up for the fact that we can't constantly be having sex. So ego is the reality principle. So a child, when they're born, all they have is id drive. All they know is crying. They need to get their way. They need to be fed. They won't live if they don't get someone to care for them. But as they get a little older, crying and stuff like that no longer works. And so they learn that other techniques to have their needs met. They learn to delay their gratification, to plan, to wait so that they can have an extra cookie, to do something really nice for mom in order to get the hug that they want, things like that. So it's just realistic. They learn other methods for getting their needs met. And it's considered to be healthy, like learning how to navigate your world and get your needs met. That's considered good in the Freudian view. And so when you think of ego, don't think of it in the way that we think about it today, often like an egotistical person is someone who's sort of narcissistic and stuck on him or herself, but rather just think about it as being like the realistic way of getting your needs met. It's like a balance between id and ego. It's considered, and superego, it's considered a good thing. If you have a strong ego, you're not going to feel that anxious about the needs of society, the pressures of society. You will still be able to experience pleasure. So a strong ego is striking a good, healthy balance in Freud's view. We'll hear different perspectives on this as we move forward. If this ego, this reality principle, never gets established, then a person would be considered to have a weak ego, and they might let id override and always give in, overeat and give in to every want and desire. or constantly feel guilty. Either way, it's a weak ego because it's not doing its job of balancing out, finding good, healthy, realistic ways of getting needs met. Freud would say psychosis, hallucinating, being delusional, is a really weak ego, really disconnected from reality. And once again, we look at ego as the balancing principle, but in order to understand what's balanced, we have to look at superego. So superego is morality, like the rules that we learn for how to get by, the rules of society, the pressures from, especially in his time, would have been from religion and the constraints on sexual behavior, which would have been very strong in the Victorian era that he was living in. So we do recognize that rules tend to be internalized, and a really key example of this relates to toileting. We all learned kind of the rules about how to eliminate and where it's appropriate to do so, and sometimes even in very dire circumstances, like a person who's, say, kidnapped or something like that and not allowed access to a bathroom will become quite ill at being unable to eliminate without the appropriate place. Like, this is a very much an internal representation of rules from family and society. So we come to that when we say internalized, it means that they're just part of who we are and we can't violate them easily. And they're a good thing. They civilize us. They allow us to live socially with other people. In fact, we have disruption in society when rules are broken, but they can weigh too heavy. And people can live their lives feeling guilty about, violating what these rules are. And so we have this ego ideal, what we would like to be, complying with all these rules, and like the social pressure to do exactly what everyone else wants. And that can be at the expense of our ability to feel any kind of pleasure, to have our needs met. So our needs are often in conflict with these rules, and the healthy ego is what balances all of those things out. Because these rules eventually become unconscious, we'll look in a minute at where they exist within the psyche. So here is that iceberg again, and you'll recall we talked about the unconscious. This is what is represented in this dark purple area, the unconscious. And then you can see the preconscious here below the surface in this light purple, and then up on top this white sticking up above, and that would represent the conscious. So look where, first off, it exists, completely in the unconscious realm. Like our id drives, we're not aware of them. They're pushing us all the time, That sudden urge arises. You're studying right now, and maybe you just had a sudden urge to go get some cookies. That's an id arising, according to what Freud would say. Superego has all three levels. We are consciously aware of the rules, and we have memories of being taught the rules and things like that, but then they become so internalized that they become like automatic and ideals that like we can't break even if we want to, like the toileting one that I gave you an example of. And then the ego, these are our habits for navigating this world, and these also reside in our conscious and in our preconscious. So we learn and are aware of the techniques we learn to get our needs met, but also in the unconscious, and that's part of like our personality, that how we navigate situations. It becomes automatic, and when things are automatic, that means we're not aware of why we're doing certain things. So part of ego also resides in the unconscious.